Appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. I hope you get some good information out of this, or good, useful information out of our presentations. And Scott, if you'll jump to the next slide, we thought we would start off with sharing just a few slides here of background information on LES and our resource portfolio. On the left side of this screen, you see a geographic representation of the LES resource portfolio and the location of all those different resources. At the top of the screen there, you'll see a little icon that represents hydro resources. We have a multi-year contract with a federal agency called the Western Administrative Power Agency. They provide us hydro power from a series of dams along the upper Missouri River Basin. We also have 3 coal plants that we either are partial owners or have long-term contracts in: Laramie River Station in Wyoming, Gerald Gentleman Station in western Nebraska, and the Walter Scott Energy Center in Council Bluffs, Iowa. We have a variety of wind resources that we participate in, sprinkled across Nebraska and Kansas and Oklahoma. And if you look at the little inset that we have here on the left side of the screen, this is a zoomed in view of the Lincoln community. And you'll see we have a few more resources in there. The blue icons represent natural gas fired plants that we have locally. We also have another wind turbine, couple of wind turbines on North 70th Street, north side of Lincoln. And then we have a landfill gas generating facility up by the landfill on the northwest or northeast part of Lincoln. And then we also have our recently added community solar array on the western part of Lincoln. And so that represents the LES resource mix. If you add all that up, it's close to about 1,300 megawatts of nameplate generation that we have. And if you look at this upper right part of the screen here, where we have some pie charts representing the changes that we've made to our resource mix over the last several years, you notice that the fuel types we have are predominantly natural gas and coal and renewable. But over the last several years, we've made a pretty significant change in the amount of renewables that we have in our resource mix. And we're actually up to about a 1/3 split between natural gas resources, coal resources, and renewable resources. And that's up from about a 12% share that renewables made up in 2008. And so this resource mix, we think, does a lot of good things for us being split like that. It gives us fuel source diversity. You see the map, it gives us geographic diversity. We'll talk a little bit more about the Southwest Power Pool later on, but it also gives us market price diversity in that our resources are spread throughout the footprint, and so we are exposed to different prices, which sometimes minimizes our risk to price concentrated areas. And then on the bottom right of the screen here, it's fairly common for utilities to represent the amount of renewables they produce as a percentage of their retail sales. And so you can see from 2008 to 2019, we increased that percentage from about 8% as a percentage of our retail sales to 46% in 2019. So a pretty significant increase there, and a lot of that driven by the wind that we added within the last 4 and 5 years. This chart on this page depicts the amount of CO2 that our resource mix emits per megawatt hour of electricity that we've produced, and that's over the time period of 2010 to 2019. And so what you can see here is that back in 2010, we were emitting something close to 1 ton of CO2 per megawatt hour for each megawatt hour that we produced. And over the period through 2019, we've reduced that down to about 0.6 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. So that equates to about a 38% reduction in our CO2 rate. And some of the major events that occurred that helped us make that reduction, we added close to 300 megawatts of wind in that time period. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, we had the landfill gas generation facility that we added in that time period. We added the solar array that we mentioned on the west part of Lincoln. I mentioned a little bit about the Southwest Power Pool. In 2014, they implemented what they call the integrated marketplace. And that's a tool that we can use and utilities in the region can use to buy and sell energy. And so when that marketplace got into operation, that had some changes in the way units were dispatched across the footprint. And so that drove some changes that reduced the amount of CO2 that we were emitting. And then also down here on the bottom right, you can see that we exited the Sheldon station. We had a long-term contract for participation in that coal-fired resource, and we were able to exit that contract. And so that again reduced the amount of CO2 that we were producing, and then also changed some of our financial activities related to that station. So when you take all those things into account, you see this metric on the bottom right here. We reduced our CO2 emissions on an annual basis by 42% in this time period from 2010 to 2019. So we thought it would be important for everyone to know that LES currently has a sustainability target. This target was adopted by the board in 2011, and the purpose of the target is to meet our projected 5-year demand growth with sustainable generation and demand reduction resources. So sustainable generation would be things like you'd probably expect: wind, solar, hydro, landfill gas, those types of things. Demand reduction resources, those would be things like our sustainable energy program or our peak rewards program. We have some arrangements in interlocal agreements, items called the District Energy Corporation and the NU Corp that we participate in. We've worked with them to do some project to reduce demand on our system. So those are the types of resources that we were expected to implement to meet this sustainability target. And the blue line on this chart represents the expected incremental increase in the demand we have on our system. And so the goal was to meet that demand growth with either sustainable generation or demand reduction resources. And so then the stacked bars represent those two items. The gray stack on the bar, or gray part of the stacked bar, is demand reduction resources, and then the green part is sustainable generation. And so what you see is that we well exceeded the demand growth on our system with either demand reduction resources or sustainable generation. The combination of both of them, we far exceeded the demand growth on our system, so helping us to meet that sustainability target. So now that we've shared some introductory and background material with you on our resources and our existing sustainability target, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, who's going to step through the series of educational materials that we shared with our board over the last year.
Thanks, Jason. As you can expect, taking on something like a new decarbonization goal is a pretty complicated issue. So the board had to go through a series of education sessions that lasted, like Jason said, over the course of a year to really get them up to speed on all the nuances, all the things that might impact this goal going forward. We're going to go through some of the high points of them today. And you can see here what we're going to look at. The first thing the board went through was an overview of the Southwest Power Pool, that electricity market and transmission organization that we participate in. Then they did a little bit more of a deep dive into the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP, did a hands-on market workshop. Then we brought in an external speaker, did a little introduction to climate change, because that's an important part of the conversation as well. Then staff did some modeling of a near zero carbon future, trying to show what the economics might look like if we replaced our resource portfolio and went to a near zero carbon emissions. Then we covered some current trends in generation portfolios, showing what other people had been doing across the country, both with setting goals and how they were following through on them. And then finally, we brought in another external speaker and we talked to the board about their dual role as a public power board. They have to wear multiple hats, and sometimes that can get difficult and pull them in different directions. And then finally, you'll notice that 3 of those presentations, those education sessions, were in November, January, and February, actually 2 in February. Those were all kind of pre-pandemic, before LES staff went home because of the pandemic. And so that became really far in the historical past. And so we actually did a review of those just to bring everybody up to speed, because it was easy to forget during that time period. Luckily for you, we're not going to do the review today. We're just going to go through each one on their own. So the first one was that overview of the Southwest Power Pool. And if you look at that, we joined, as Jason said, I think in 2009. They started their integrated market in 2014, but the Southwest Power Pool has actually been around since 1941. So it's been a player for a long time. And you can see a map there on the right that shows the Southwest Power Pool's footprint. It runs from about northern Texas all the way up to the Canadian border. And it's about the width of Nebraska all the way up. So pretty big area. Now they have a lot of jobs they do, but you can kind of pick out 4 of the primary ones. The first is they serve as what's called a consolidated balancing authority. It is their job to balance load and generation. And I'm sure most of you realize those have to balance perfectly every second, every minute, every hour, every day, forever. And it used to be LES's job before we joined SPP. We balanced load and generation for our area, just like all the utilities in SPP did. When they went to their new market in 2014, they took that role on. So they're now balancing load and generation across that entire footprint you see in front of you. A big part of that is serving as a reliability coordinator. That means they are monitoring and anticipating issues we might see on the grid, and then trying to coordinate a regional response to make sure they keep the lights on. That's obviously a big job for them. They're a regional transmission organization, so by name, a big part of their role is as a transmission planner. They direct all the transmission in their footprint, and from 2004 to 2018, that was in excess of $10 billion worth of new projects and upgrades. And then finally, because of that electricity market, they have the role of a market operator. They have to administer a competitive electricity market to make sure that they're reliably serving the load at the lowest possible cost. Now, the next session the board went into was that deeper dive, that hands-on workshop in how the Southwest Power Pool market really works from the standpoint of energy, capacity, and reliability. Now, we don't have time to do a hands-on workshop with you today, but here were some of the main points we went through with the board throughout that exercise. The first one is LES has a simple rule they have to follow with SPP, just like all the SPP members. We're required to bring enough accredited generation capacity to the market to meet our peak load plus a 12% reserve margin. The idea is every member brings an extra 12% of generation to the market. And so when you have generation outages, when you have unit failures, you've got enough to still meet the reliability needs, the load needs of the entire footprint. Now, the key word there is, I said, accredited generation. If you have traditional dispatchable resources like coal, natural gas, nuclear, things that are kind of at your control, well, for the most part, whatever their maximum rating is, that's what you can accredit them at. So if you put in 100 megawatts of natural gas, Southwest Power Pool or SPP, they're going to give you credit for 100 megawatts. But if you have non-traditional resources, non-dispatchable resources, things like wind and solar, things you don't control, Mother Nature controls, well, then you only get to count a portion of those. So for something like wind, you might put in 100 megawatts of wind and only get to count 25, 20, maybe even 15% of that as accredited capacity. And with the Southwest Power Pool rules, even more important, as more of that type of resource are added across the footprint, the amount you get a credit for each one continues to go down as you go into the future. So that's something you have to keep in mind as you add renewable resources. Now, LES, we select all the resources that make up our portfolio. But the Southwest Power Pool, because they administer the electricity market, they decide what's going to run. They tell you when to start them, when to stop them, and what level they should operate at. So because of that, the Southwest Power Pool, they actually control the energy that our resources produce in the market. And as part of that market, it's not just that they're dispatching our resources, they're dispatching resources across the entire footprint. And it's amazing. The dispatch of resources all over SPP can have a huge impact on the financial bottom line of how our resources are handled with the revenue side. So we're part of a big pond now, and things that happen all over have ripple effects that affect our bottom line every day. And then finally, I already mentioned SPP, they have that responsibility to balance load and generation across their entire footprint. And that's a job that's getting more difficult each and every day. It used to be not too long ago that the only variable you had to worry about was the load. You could control all the generation. The load went up and down at its own whim, so you ran the generation up and down to match. Nowadays, that's much tougher because you have two variables. You have the load, but you also have the non-dispatchable resources, that wind and solar in the footprint. And there's a lot of wind in the Southwest Power Pool. Since SPP doesn't have control of that, they have to guess where the load is going to go, guess where the wind is going to go, and have the generation resources ready of a dispatchable nature to be able to cover for both of those when they move up and down. Now, at that point, we brought in an external speaker. It was Stoney Cooper, who's the Nebraska Measurement Manager, and he gave kind of a climate change 101 to the board. Talked about the complexity of the issues that make up climate change and also some of the impacts we can expect to see here in the state of Nebraska. You know, his key points he covered with us on the board were that climate change is real and it's here now, but it's not too late. And also that humans are the primary cause. And that doesn't sound great, but in that is a silver lining. And that's that since humans are the primary cause, it gives you a perfect opportunity to be a big part of the solution. And now he said Nebraska can expect to see temperatures 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher in 2050 than what we're experiencing today. And when you see that, you say, well, that doesn't sound that bad, 2 to 5 degrees. But you got to dig into how that's going to happen. And what you see is the frequency of extreme warm days is going to double, and the frequency of extreme cold days is going to be cut in half. So you're going to see those temperature rises on the days you'd most like to not see them. Now, we're also expecting to see more precipitation in the spring and winter and less in the summer when you'd need it most. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of that precipitation is expected to come in the form of heavy rain events. What's that bring with it? Flooding and all the difficulties that come from that. And then finally, the main thing he left us with was that the sooner we act, the less risky it is. The more you can do now, the more of this you stave off in the future. The next education session was going through and modeling that near zero carbon future. Doing an economic analysis to say if we transitioned our resource portfolio from what it is today to almost no carbon emissions, what might that look like financially? Well, given the best information we have today, LES would have to double rates to reach a net zero carbon goal by 2030. Why did we pick 2030? Well, we had a lot of folks coming in, board meetings, making public comments about we should set a goal to do this by 2030. And at the same time, once you get further out from 2030, our crystal ball is not as clear. We kind of know what resources we have available. So we did the modeling in 2030, and that was a pretty stark indication that the cost could be high if you don't do this correctly, doubling your rates in that period. So what's that actually mean? Well, that means for a typical residential customer, it's an incremental cost of about $4,000 over that period. That's $4,000 in excess of what you would have normally paid LES over that period. For a typical industrial customer, near and dear to all of your hearts, that's an additional $10 million over that period. So not cost to be taken lightly. However, the thing we left with the board is an analysis like this includes so many assumptions and so many unknowns that you just can't accurately assess that future financial impacts. We do the best we can, but things are going to change with technology. Things are going to change with regulations. You don't know what's coming. So we can do the best we can do to predict it, but it's hard to see the future. So you got to take all these costs with a little bit of a grain of salt. Finally, in the end, setting a goal has no financial impacts whatsoever. The financial impacts come afterwards when you're faced with all the decisions, all those various forks in the road where you have to decide what resources to add, maybe what resources to get rid of. That's where the dollar implications come in. That's where you have to be prudent, do your due diligence, and try to make the right decisions at the right times. And honestly, that would be no different if the board didn't set a goal. You're going to face a lot of those same decisions every day regardless.
So at the July board meeting, we performed quite a bit of research into what other utilities were setting for CO2 or decarbonization or renewable goals, and shared that with staff or shared that with the board in a presentation that we called Current Trends in Generation Portfolios. And what we found as we compared our performance and looked at what other utilities were setting for goals is that there were basically three types of goals that other utilities were setting. There were percentage renewable resource goals, where the utilities are trying to set some percentage of their total generation that would come from renewable resources. They were setting goals to reduce the amount of CO2 emissions that were coming from their generating resource mix. And then carbon neutrality goals or net zero goals, where they would do some type of mitigating activity to take away or offset the amount of CO2 that they were producing from their generating resources by some type of other technology or other mitigating effort. So what we found, and similar to what we shared in the previous slides that we shared with you, is that even though LES has not had a CO2 goal set previously, the rate at which our resources were emitting CO2, or that tons per megawatt hour of CO2 emission, that dropped by 38% over the 2010 to 2019 timeframe. And then, like we mentioned previously, the total tons of CO2 that we've been emitting on an annual basis dropped by 42% over that same period. We also looked at the other utilities that we compared to see what percentage of their total generation was coming from renewable resources. And what we found is that the percentage of renewables in our portfolio either met or exceeded all the other utilities that we compared to in that presentation. And then we also looked at utilities that had set some type of zero CO2 or net zero CO2, 100% CO2 reduction, those types of goals, and found that that 42% reduction in the total tons of CO2 that we had emitted, that exceeded any of those utilities that had set a similar type goal. So in the August board meeting, we brought in a gentleman by the name of Ken Colburn, works with a company called Symbiotic Strategies. Mr. Colburn has a background in utility regulatory matters, and now he provides technical assistance and public policy assistance to electric utility boards. And what he shared with the board was the often various and competing roles and responsibilities that public power board members share in their different roles as director and regulator and then consumer advocate for the utilities that they serve. So in their director role, board members take on a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interest of the organization, pursue the organization's missions and goals in a prudent fashion. And as a regulator, the board members, they take on the role of trying to balance the public interest or the government regulatory function with those of the customers. And they do that by trying to set rates and charges that are just, reasonable, and not unduly discriminatory. But then he mentioned this additional competing role, which is that of a consumer advocate. And this sometimes creeps into the situation if there are boards that are elected by the public. And so those board members may have run on certain platforms or made certain campaign promises that now when they're on the board, they find out those might be in conflict with some of the goals they need to achieve in their director role or their regulator role. So they have to balance all of that with also doing the role of representing their customers in their elected position. So Mr. Colburn mentioned that there are many risks facing the utilities today, and as it relates to the generation resource portfolio, those boards could choose to take certain types of risk with their portfolios. Maybe they want to pursue a business as usual strategy with their generation portfolio and accept the risks that come with that. Or maybe they want to go towards the other end of the spectrum and implement a cutting edge technology resource portfolio mix and take on the risks that come with that. But no matter what they choose to do, even if they can try to choose the types of risks they incur, there's really no way for the boards to avoid all risk. And there are going to be some risks that they just have to make decisions on and try their best to balance all the different and competing roles that they're playing and make the best decisions possible. So now that you've seen the educational background material we shared with the board and the year's worth of different topics that we covered with them, we wanted to share then the material that we use to frame up the decarbonization goal with our board and present it to you in an identical fashion to what we did with our board and the way we framed up that decision-making process. So one of the first things we wanted to point out to you here is the fact that there is a climate action plan that has been recently announced by the mayor and the city of Lincoln. And in that climate action plan, they set out a goal for the community. And that community goal is that the community will achieve an 80% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So in the context of all that educational material that we shared with the board, and then also this goal that has now been proposed for the community, we laid out a decision-making process for the board in the following fashion. We mentioned to the board that we think there are basically two decision paths that you have to go down. If you go down the path of setting a renewable goal, which we mentioned to you is one of the types of goals that we saw a lot of utilities setting. If you go down the path of a renewable goal, well, then there are a couple key decisions you need to make. One is what percentage of renewables are you going to try to achieve? Things we saw would be items like 50% or 80% or 100%, or maybe some other percentage renewable goal. And then what year do you want to achieve that percentage? 2030, 2040, 2050, maybe some other year. If you go down the path on the right side of the screen here, if you go down the path of setting a CO2 reduction goal, well, you have a similar choice to make on the percentage of the year and the year. What CO2 percentage reduction are you going to try to achieve? Popular items would be like 80%, 90%, 100%, or maybe some other percent. And then again, what year? 2030, 2040, 2050, maybe some other year that you'd like to achieve that CO2 percent reduction. And then the concept of a net goal. And we'll get into this a little bit more in a later presentation, but you need to choose if you're going to have a net CO2 reduction goal. And if you pick a net goal, that means that there might be other tools and technologies available to you to somehow offset the CO2 emissions that you're still creating from some of your existing generating resources. And like I said, we'll dive into that just a little bit more detail in a later slide here. So if you go down the path of setting a percentage renewable goal, it typically takes the format of some percent renewable by some future year. Some text examples that we saw from other utilities would be things like generating 50% of your electricity from renewable resources by 2050 or 2040, or maybe generating 100% of your electricity from renewable resources by 2050, or maybe a different format, something that says 100% of the energy consumed by customers will be renewable by 2050. In terms of our generation mix, if you go down this path of a renewable goal, well, depending on the magnitude of the renewable percentage that is set, you'll most likely see reduced output all the way up to retirement of our fossil fuel units. When we're looking at the types of generation that we think we'd have available to us in this type of goal, it's the ones you'd probably expect to hear: wind, solar, hydro, biofuels. But then we also put nuclear on this list, but with a question mark behind it. There's a little bit of debate within the industry whether or not nuclear counts as a renewable resource, but it would sure be nice to have all the tools in your toolbox to try to meet a renewable goal if you could have renewable, or if you could have nuclear in your mix. We also think energy storage is going to be a key component of any type of renewable goal. Scott mentioned the need for accredited capacity in the Southwest Power Pool. And one way that you could potentially achieve some more accredited generating capacity is by having energy storage. So this would be technologies like pumped hydro or battery storage or any other kind of new storage technologies that might come along. And then another technology that seems to be gaining a little bit of interest and attraction is using hydrogen as an energy carrier or a fuel source to produce electricity. And there are a variety of different ways that you can produce hydrogen, and different ways that you produce it then get labeled with different levels of renewable resource content. And if you can produce that hydrogen with zero CO2 or fully mitigated CO2, well, then that would be considered green hydrogen. And you could probably count that in your resource mix for achieving a renewable resource goal. And then the last box we have on here, this CO2 emissions mitigating technologies. On this particular slide, we left this box blank, because if we go down the path of a renewable goal, well, then really the metric that staff is going to be trying to achieve is what percentage of our total energy production comes from renewables as it relates to all the energy that we produced. We won't specifically be tracking CO2 emissions, we'll be tracking percentage renewables. And so all those CO2 emissions might be a byproduct of achieving a higher percentage of renewables. That's not really the metric that we'll be tracking in a percent renewable goal. So then the other path that we mentioned that utilities are going down for setting some type of decarbonization goal would be a CO2 percentage reduction goal. And this takes the form of some percent reduction in CO2 by some future year. So examples that we saw would be goals like reduce CO2 emissions 80% by 2050 from 2010 levels, or maybe reduce CO2 emissions 100% by 2050. This would be another way of saying a zero CO2 goal, or maybe having 100% non-carbon resource mix by the year 2050. As it relates to our generation mix, well, again, depending on the magnitude and the percentage CO2 reduction that's put into the goal, you'll most likely see reduced output from our fossil fuel units all the way up to retirement. But we do pick up some extra tools in our toolbox with this type of goal. You may see in this type of goal retrofits of our existing fossil fuel units with some type of CO2 emissions controls technologies. And then in terms of the resources we would expect to have available to us, well, it's the same list we mentioned in the renewable goal: wind, solar, hydro, biofuels, nuclear, energy storage, hydrogen. But then we have this column that we put in the middle here that's bold texted. So what you could possibly see in this type of goal is natural gas resources added to utilities resource mix. And the reason for that is that it takes on average about, it produces about half the CO2 per megawatt hour of energy produced to create electricity from natural gas than by burning coal. So if you can swap out your coal resources with natural gas resources, you automatically get something close to a 50% reduction in your CO2 emissions. Or you could see things like retrofits of natural gas, existing natural gas plants with CO2 emissions mitigating technologies, or maybe even coal plants that get retrofitted with CO2 emissions controls technologies. And now down in this bottom category here, the types of emissions, CO2 emissions mitigating technologies we have available to us would be things like carbon capture and storage. There's a lot of research going on into that to make sure that it's both technically and financially viable. So if that continues along some of the trajectories that organizations are projecting, carbon capture and storage could be a tool available to us in our toolbox to mitigate CO2 emissions. And then energy efficiency. The theory here being that if you can reduce the amount of energy that customers need, well, that reduces the amount of energy that the utilities need to produce. And if some of that energy reduction comes from not running fossil fuel resources, we're going to reduce the amount of CO2 that you produce in those activities. And then the last type of goal would be a net CO2 reduction. It takes the form of some net reduction in CO2 by some future year. And so examples of this would be reducing our net CO2 emissions 80% by 2050 from 2010 levels. Well, this takes the format of the goal that was proposed by the mayor in the Climate Action Plan. Another format that you could see would be net zero CO2 emissions from electric generation by 2050, or maybe something like 100% carbon neutrality by 2050. In terms of our generation portfolio and the resources we have available to us, a lot of this is very similar to what we shared on the last slide. Depending on the magnitude of the CO2 reduction, you can see reduced output from our fossil units all the way up to retirement. You can see retrofits of existing plants with CO2 emissions controls technologies. In terms of emissions mitigating technologies for CO2, once again, we hope to have available to us things like carbon capture and storage and energy efficiency. But with this netting function, now you maybe pick up a few other tools in your toolbox. Items that have been discussed in a lot of the literature we've been reading would be activities like tree planting or reforestation, where if you could add to the trees around the community or on the planet for that matter, they would absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in the tree. So netting out that reduction in CO2 by pulling it out of the atmosphere. There are some modified agricultural practices that we've been reading around, things like cover crops or different fertilization practices that would help sequester that carbon from the atmosphere into the soils. And then you could take a net reduction in your emissions of CO2 by helping or encouraging some of these activities to occur. Electrification or fuel conversion, the theory here being that if you can take an existing function that's done by burning fossil fuels and instead convert that function to be performed by electricity as the energy source, and if that electricity has a lower or no CO2 content in it for being produced, well, then your net result is you're performing the same function, but producing or emitting less CO2. So there's a net reduction in CO2. And if the utility is doing something to encourage that behavior, well, then maybe we get to count that as part of our netting goal. And then the broad category of other, we're optimistic that as we go down this decarbonization goal path, there are new technologies and new ideas that come along that provide opportunities for us to use other things to net our CO2 and ultimately reduce the total CO2 that we're producing. So with the board, we ended up back on this decision tree slide. Like I said, we shared all this same information with them and a lot of the background that it takes to make this decision. And we ended up back on this slide here and posed the questions to them about what type of goal do you want to set and which one of these decision tree paths do you want to go down. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Scott, who will go through the results that we got when we discussed this with our board and got their thoughts and feelings on it.
As Jason said, we went through this with the board at the October board meeting. So just back on October 16th, a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to take you through the questions we asked them and the responses that we received. Now, this was all preliminary polling. It was anonymous. I just wanted to get a feel for where the board members were at and could we start to build some consensus, maybe not on an actual goal, but starting to whittle our way down to getting in the ballpark of a similar goal for everyone's thinking. So the first thing we asked them is, what type of decarbonization goal do you currently prefer? Now, we asked, they could do no new goal, which would mean stay with our existing sustainability target. They could do a new CO2 reduction goal, or they could do a new renewable goal. And you can see the bulk of them, we're looking at a new CO2 reduction goal. We did have one board member who wanted to stay with the existing sustainability target. And just to give you a little bit of a frame of reference there, Everybody's heard all the talk about a potential data center looking to come to town. And a lot of times those data centers have a pretty high load. If you added a significant load to the LES system, that sustainability target, where we're supposed to offset future load growth with either demand side management like energy efficiency projects or sustainable generation like wind and solar, boy, that would be a heavy lift. And it would take you, at least in the near to medium term, down all the same paths that a decarbonization goal would take you. So I think that was some of the thinking with potentially sticking with that goal. But you can see the majority were looking at a new CO2 reduction goal. So we ask them, okay, if we're looking at a new CO2 reduction goal, do you currently prefer a net type goal? And as Jason just mentioned, net means we get to use other things that would basically subtract some CO2 emissions from the atmosphere, maybe outside of our power resources directly. And you can see that was 100%. Everybody was looking at a net type reduction goal. Make sure we have all the tools in our toolbox to help us achieve it. And then we asked the board, what percentage would you currently prefer to target? And at this point, we're looking at a net CO2 reduction goal because that's what the majority was targeting. And as you can see, most of them were on 100% and then a few at 95%. So the reduction was 95% or 100%. And we also asked them, what completion tier year would you prefer to target? You know, if you're going to make a 95 or 100% reduction, by what year do you want to get there? And you can see we had the most votes there for 2040, followed by 2045 and 2050. Now, this is a little weird because it's hard to talk about the percent reduction and the year you want to achieve it as two separate things because they kind of yin and yang. They have something to go with each other. But that's how we gave it to the board as just this preliminary polling. Now what we want to do is change it up a little bit. This is going to get a little bit more fun for you. We're going to go through and do some attendee polling. We're going to ask you some similar questions to what we went through with the board. But first, we're going to lead off with some demographic questions, get a feel for who we've got here. Now, some of this is going to be a little weird because we know we're not at a public meeting, right? So some of these will just be practice questions for you. The first one is, are you an LES customer? I imagine we're going to get an overwhelming response of yes here, but everybody go ahead, submit your responses, and then we'll see what the results are.
Got about 20 responses, and we have some LES folks that are on here, so that may represent primarily most of the customers there. So let me share the results here.
Okay.
We got 20
Very
LES
good.
customers.
Everybody did a good job there. Everybody showed they're an LES customer. The next one, this is also going to probably be just a warm-up question for all of you who are on the call. But at the public meetings, we're asking, are you a residential customer, a business customer, or both? I would imagine there's a chance we have quite a few boths in the room today. Probably those who aren't are business customers.
Okay, looks like we got most of our responses in.
Okay, kind of what you expected.
So we got
A lot of both, a lot of followed by business, and then we've got some residential there. Okay, so now we're done with the warm-up questions. Now this one takes a little longer. It's a little more involved because we're asking the customers of all the LES programs and incentive rates that we have out there, which ones have you participated in? And we want you to select all of them that apply. So you look at community solar, where we put in the first utility scale solar project in the state of Nebraska, and the Sun Shares program, where you can contribute as little as $3 per month every month to help support that program. Or virtual net metering, where you can actually purchase the rights to a panel, and through the magic of the billing system, we make it look like that panel actually sits on the roof of your home or your business. And so every month your bill says, here's how much energy you purchased from LES. Here's how much energy you saved yourself by providing it yourself through your virtual net metering panel. On the customer-owned generation side, we have net metering, where people are putting in solar up to 25 kW and offsetting their consumption. We also have the renewable generation rate, where either businesses can put in larger solar, 25 to 100 kW, or you can actually partner with your neighbors in terms of neighborhood solar, where once a month LES cuts you a check for everything you produce at an incentivized rate, and then you can split it up with your other partners. Also on the load management side, you've got the Sustainable Energy Program incentives. I'm sure everybody on here is familiar with those, where we can help you out with lighting your HVAC equipment, put you into higher efficiencies at a lower cost. And then also peak rewards. We're able to run people's Wi-Fi thermostats on hot summer days, pre-cool their house a little bit earlier in the afternoon, so that later in the afternoon when LES is approaching our peak, hopefully that air conditioner is not running. We've got a lot of stuff out there on electric vehicles. We've been offering electric vehicle rebates where you can get a rebate for a new purchase of an electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. And also we have an EV interest group with a lot of participants where we offer a lot of great content, both webinars, mailings, things where they can keep up to date. We have a lot of people in that who have EVs and a lot of people who don't have one yet, but they're looking at it, so they're very interested. We also have our Renewable Energy Certificate Program, or our REC program. For every megawatt hour that's produced from wind or solar resources, the DOE has authorized that a REC, basically a paper certificate, is produced from that. And the holder of that REC actually gets to say they're 100% renewable for that energy. They own that renewable energy. So LES has a program that makes it really simple. You can sign up every month on your bill. We look at how much energy you purchased and we add on the price of the RECs. It's a really economical way for you to lower your carbon footprint and officially be 100% renewable. And then finally, paperless billing. You're able to sign up for paperless billing. It keeps all electronic. It allows us to not have to go through the paper, not have to put the effort in to mail in those bills. So everybody go through, please mark off which of those that you've participated in, whether you're at a business or at your home, and we'll see what the numbers are. And remember, this is everything you've been in. So click multiple ones.
And it looks like we just about are there. Looks like we've got participants in a variety of things. I'll just give it another 5 seconds here.
And I will tell you, make sure you scroll down because at least on my screen, the bottom one or two, I've got to grab the scroll bar on the right, the gray bar, and pull it down. Otherwise, I can't see all of them. Okay, as we kind of expect with this group, SEP, big winner, leader in the clubhouse. Good to see we've got a lot of folks on peak rewards. I see paperless billing very highly represented. I've got some people in virtual net metering. That's good. We got somebody in renewable generation rate. Not too many people were in on that, so that's very good to see. And then we've got somebody I'm really pleased to see that took us up on one of our electric vehicle rebates. That's very helpful. It goes a long ways towards deferring the cost of those EVs. So very good, very good. So that's the end of our demographic information. Now we actually get into where you give us some feedback that we can carry back to the board. So now we're just asking your preference. In consideration of a long-term net carbon dioxide goal, what percentage reduction would you prefer for LES to target? We've got 50% on there, 60, 70, 80. Then we give you a little more granularity, 85, 90, 95, and 100. Or if you prefer not to see us target that goal, you can say none. And just to fill you in, why did we only start at 50%? Well, as Jason pointed out a couple of times, LES is already at a 42% reduction. So there doesn't seem to be much sense in setting a goal below 50% because everything else we've already achieved. So let us know where you think you'd like us to fall there.
Still got a few out there.
That's good. People are taking their time. This is a big decision. Big decision.
Wait just another 10 seconds here. Okay.
Okay. Let's see what we got here.
And just so you know, we will be asking by what year as well in this polling series.
So looks like the lead is 100%, followed very closely by 80%, matching the city's goal. Looks like next might be 70%, and then we've got a smattering from 50% all the way through none. Looks like we had someone on every one, so pretty good distribution, actually. So that's very interesting. And now, as Mark said, we're going to ask you, what year would you like to see LES target that reduction? 2030, 2035, 40, 45, 50, or if you were on none before, we give you a none here as well. So this is the year that you'd like us to see we target the reduction you were thinking about. Everybody's thinking about it again. That's good.
I think we've got everybody in here. 5 more seconds. All right.
Okay, so 2040, almost half the vote. Then it looks like we have 2050, 2030, and then again a smattering of the other ones all the way through none. So again, pretty good distribution, but it looks like most people were targeting 2040. And again, this is a little weird because everybody's thinking about a different percentage by their year of 2040, maybe depending on how they looked at it. But thank you for the feedback. And we got one more question for you. Now this one revolves around that polling the LES board did. They actually ended up having pretty close to a consensus, we found out. We went through this very similar exercise because what they came up with were ranges for a 95 to 100% reduction in net carbon dioxide emissions by 2040 to 2045. So given those ranges that the board kind of whittled down to, what would be your preference for an LES goal? We've given you all the combinations, a 95% reduction in net carbon dioxide by 2040 or a 95% reduction by 2045. Likewise, you could do a 100% reduction by 2040 or a 100% reduction by 2045. So given what the LES board had kind of expressed some ideas about, tell us what you would think for what you'd like LES to pursue.
Five more seconds here and I'll share the results.
Okay, I was gonna guess we were gonna have a pretty big spread. I almost stuck my neck out and said it. Now I should have because I look smart. But we do definitely have that. Looks like most people are on the 95% reduction by 2045. Really close is 95% reduction by 2040. Not that much different though than 100% reduction by 2040, and even a pretty good contingent on 100% reduction by 2045. You'd expect though to see kind of a broad range there because honestly, the ranges the board came up with, they're fairly tight already. There's not a huge ton of difference between 95% or 100% or 24 or 2045. So you expect to be fairly well grouped. So we appreciate that. We will take this feedback back to the LES board as they make their final considerations on how to finalize this goal. So at this point, you've reached the best point in the presentation. You no longer have to listen to Jason and I. We're going to open it up. We want to hear your comments. If you have any questions on the stuff we've covered, by all means, ask those too. But we'd love to take any other feedback you might have on LES's goal and where you think we should head with it.
So a couple of reminders for questions here. You can enter the question in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand, if you will. There's a little icons if you click into the chat box if you want to ask your question live. And then I also want to say that one of our participants may not have may be joining us only by phone, and so he entered his preferences in the chat box, and we will include that feedback to the information we got on the poll. So I just want to let that individual know who provided that we will include your feedback as well. We did get a question, Scott and Jason, during the presentation. The question was, what percentage of the total worldwide greenhouse gas emissions are related to the United States in 2019, and what's the estimates for 2050? So you may not have that specifically, but do you have an idea of how much greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to the United States versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, actually, so right now, the U.S. contributes about 14% of world greenhouse gas emissions. I do not walk around with that nugget of information in my head. Some crack LES staff in the name of Shelley Sailing saw that question and shot Jason and I the email so we could look smart. I do not have any information yet, though, on how it's going to look going towards 2050, because there, Shelley only sent me a link and I would actually have to go read something. So that one we might have to look up and give you the answer later. Thank you, Shelley.
We've got some good questions coming in here. If LES is estimating this effort would double the cost, how does that split between a typical residential customer and a large user, with about half of total cost coming from demand and kilowatt hours? Will that still double? So the question is, okay, you're doubling costs. Is that primarily a function of energy, a function of demand costs, or a combination of thereof?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. I'm gonna guess that. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I'd have to think about it too and actually get together with our rates group to figure out how that spreads out. But this doubling of costs is going to come from the power production or the power supply portfolio. You know, so that doubling that we would see in our costs or the power supply costs would then be spread amongst all the customers based on what percentage of the power cost resources, the power costs we incurred that they use for their customer class. And so how that splits up, you know, is a little bit different because of the way the charges are placed between residential and like the person that commented or the person that questioned here on demand charges. So to be quite honest, I'd have to get together with our rates group to make an accurate answer on that. I just know it wouldn't be equally distributed because not all the power cost resources are equally distributed amongst all the customer classes.
And when you look at the industrial class, you would see, I think, some of that on the energy side and definitely some of that on the demand side, because we'd be having to add a lot more resources where you're going to see a lot of that in the demand component. So I think you're going to see some of it on both.
And just to you know, to clarify for everybody, even though we don't have demand charges for residential and small business, there are capacity costs that are built into those rates. They just happen to be primarily currently today part of the energy rate. So there is a way to recapture the capacity costs from all of our classes, regardless of whether they have a demand charge or not. There was a comment that this participant thinks the costs associated with the goal should be part of the question. So that's just something to think about. And then I'm going to call on Lalit, who wanted to ask his question verbally. Go ahead, Lalit, and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Jason and Scott, very good presentation, first of all. Seems like you guys have done a good job thinking through the whole process, and you're taking a good holistic approach in reducing your carbon by even using strategies that help you with carbon reduction, not just in your production. My question relates back to SPP. So you are talking about increasing your renewable portfolio, but in the end, SPP is determining the dispatch of generation across the whole region. So how would your goal align with their dispatch decisions when it comes to achieving or not achieving your goal despite the increase in rates?
Yeah,
I think,
go ahead.
go ahead, Jason.
I was gonna say that's a good observation, Lit, and a very significant component to this is that we don't dictate or we don't choose what resources the market dispatches, but we do get to choose what resources we bring to the market. And so we'd have to make choices about resources and then their CO2 emissions rate. And there will be a little bit of risk, in that we might have resources that the market likes, and so it dispatches them, but those might be resources that emit CO2. So as we get down the road of trying to reduce CO2 emissions, we'd most likely have to change our resource mix so that those resources are not available in the market for SPP to dispatch and then us incur those CO2 emissions. The trick will be like what I think Scott mentioned in an earlier slide, is that we have to maintain a minimum amount of accredited capacity that meets our peak load plus 12%. And so if we need to bring different resources to the market to meet that peak demand plus 12% requirement, well, then we have to bring a new type of resource that may not get accredited at such high a value as like the traditional resources. So you may end up with a lot more resources in your portfolio just to obtain the amount of accredited capacity that you need to meet your SPP requirements.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is the only way you could really guarantee it, Lilit, is you've got to add resources that just don't emit much carbon at all. So you go with renewable resources, or if you go with natural gas, now you've got to put carbon capture and sequestration on them. If they're not going to run very much in the market, maybe you don't need that step. But if you want to be insured, you'd have to probably spend a premium, and make sure that even if the Southwest Power Pool operates them, they're not emitting any carbon emissions. So those will be the decisions that LES and their board will have to face over the coming decades.
Right. Well, my question more is, what if they don't even dispatch the resources that you're adding because they are not as readily useful for them? They're not as available on demand. So my question really goes back to, I think, what I'm really trying to ask is there any provision in your partnership or relationship with SPP that allows you to add production capability that is sort of outside the market for them, so you can have a little more control over at least a portion of your production ability if SPP market is going in a different direction? Now, I know SPP itself is becoming more green and more renewable across the portfolio from a couple of presentations I attended from SPP, but I'm just trying to figure out if there is a way that you could kind of pick and choose on your own, and also or everything that is LES's production portfolio will be part of SPP's production portfolio.
Yeah, well, there are some options to have resources available to you that are not part of the market. The terminology of the industry would be behind the meter resources. So
Right.
Generation that we have that is producing and is doing something to offset our load, but you don't get to, or you're not entering it into the market. And so even though that resource might exist, you wouldn't get to count it towards accredited capacity. And so, there's currently no way around having to bring that appropriate amount of accredited capacity to the market. So even if we did figure out a way to put a bunch of behind the meter resources in, we'd still have enough accredited capacity, or need to have enough accredited capacity in the market to meet that peak load plus 12%. And like you said, go ahead.
I was just going to add on those behind the meter resources, those are limited to just a few megawatts. So you can't do large resources. These are really small resources, 3, 4, 5 megawatts. So they don't make that big of an impact. And the only other thing I was going to add is with the Southwest Power Pool, they have a must offer requirement. So every resource that we bring to SPP, we have to offer it to the market, and we have to let them dispatch it. So you can't really cherry pick and say, hey, I've got some things here I'm going to put in, and I don't want you to operate them as much maybe because they're going to impact my carbon goal. Nope, if you give them, once you hand them the keys, they get to drive the car.
I get it.
And then they also have a oversight function. They call it the market monitoring unit. And the way the market chooses which units it's going to dispatch is by looking at the offer curve, or the parameters that we set for entering our units into the market. Well, this market monitoring unit is looking at all the generators that are submitting offer curves to make sure that they look reasonable. So if your thought was, well, I'm going to keep my existing resources, but I'm just going to change my offer curve to make sure the dispatch is something that I prefer. Well, eventually that regulatory function is going to look at that and start asking questions, why are you offering your unit in this manner? That doesn't line up with industry best practices or what we're seeing from other utilities. So there's limited abilities to try to manipulate how your units are offered and then run by the market.
As a Lincolnite, it was a very selfish question. I get it. I was just trying to figure out if there was a way to do that.
Well, Jason, the other thing you might want to explain is you can self-dispatch, but then you're taking the financial risk associated with that.
Yep, that's correct. Like Kevin mentioned, there's a tool available to you that you can take your units and essentially tell the market, I want you to run them no matter what. But like Kevin mentioned, there's a risk with that. If market prices become, considerably lower than maybe what the cost to run your unit is, but you're telling the market, I want this unit to run. Well, now you could be running that unit at a loss or sometimes even a very significant loss if prices in the market go to negative values.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Good questions, Lilit. Thank you for those great questions. We've got some more questions that have come in as well. There was a question about compared to a non-emitting resource like wind, how does the CO2 emissions compare of a coal plant?
Well, so just pure emissions. A wind
emissions.
project or a wind plant doesn't emit any CO2. There's some discussion in the industry about the CO2 that it takes to actually create and install the wind project. But once the wind is producing, it has zero CO2 emissions, where a coal plant, depending on its efficiency, age, different emissions controls on it, it's probably in the neighborhood of somewhere around 1 ton of CO2 per megawatt hour.
And we should specify the LES goal is on our CO2 production. So even like Jason mentioned, there might be some discussion about how many pounds of CO2 are produced in actually building a wind turbine. That would not be core to LES's goal because we're looking at what our emissions would be once that resource is in place.
So we have another question here about the low carbon future, and is that the low carbon future costs increased? If you see increases in the future with a low carbon future, is that going to be more due to higher cost demand and capacity costs or higher cost energy for the entire SPP?
So I will tell you what drove a lot of those costs is you've already got an entire resource fleet which works perfectly well, performs well on the market, but it emits some CO2. And so if you want to go to a near zero carbon future, you've got to retire those resources and build new ones. And that's where a lot of those costs come from. And on the second part is some of what Lilit got to. When you put in those new carbon resources, those new low carbon resources, they might not perform as well in the market. So you're not bringing as much revenue. So you really get hit two ways. One is on the capital side. You've got to spend all that money to replace your fleet, maybe before it needed to go away from a technology standpoint. And then once you do replace it, those new resources, they might not be seen as valuable to the SPP market. And so you don't bring as much revenue as you used to, which impacts your energy costs. So hopefully that helps out a little bit.
Just so everybody knows, thank you, Shelley, for posting a link to the Energy Information Administration. That may address the questions regarding what the contribution of CO2 is globally by attributable to the United States. I'm assuming that that information would pertain to that discussion we were having just a little earlier. Another question is, does LES have a formal position that emissions from electric generation from coal and natural gas are a significant contributor to climate change?
So I'll take a first crack at that, and maybe Shelley can help me out if I mess it up. But we have a legislative guideline document, and in there we do indicate that we acknowledge CO2 emissions are a contributor to CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And like I said, that's in our legislative guidelines.
Another question is, what is the most expensive source of generation in the LES network per kilowatt hour produced?
So if you're talking about in the LES network, I assume you mean in the LES resource fleet. That's a little bit of a tough question, because if you look at some of our older natural gas combustion turbines, which are sitting here in Lincoln, they're far and away the highest cost on a dollar per kilowatt hour or dollar per megawatt hour of production. But remember, we talked about with the Southwest Power Pool, they require us to have enough generation, accredited generation, to meet our peak load plus that 12%. So we have to provide capacity, megawatts. We're not really required to provide energy, megawatt hours. So even though a lot of those older natural gas resources are the most expensive on a per unit of energy per megawatt hour basis, they're actually some of the cheapest on a dollar per megawatt basis. So you got to factor in both those things. What's it cost me to produce the energy, and what's it cost to have the accredited capacity on the books to meet the SPP requirements? So it's always a balance. It's not as simple as just looking at what it costs to make the energy. You have to look at what it costs just to have the resource on paper as well.
Another question is, do you anticipate advancements in nuclear power in the next 5 to 10 years, such as traveling wave reactors?
Okay, so I'm not familiar with traveling wave reactors, but I do know there is a company, I think it's called New Scale, might be the name I can remember. They have a small modular reactor that's gone through at least a few different levels of NRC review. And I read an article recently that there are some utilities out in the western part of the US that have signed up to try to get one of those small modular reactors put into service. So in 5 to 10 years, yeah, I think that's what the folks at NewScale were trying to accomplish. I think the challenge for them right now is making sure they have all the participants lined up and the funding available to go forward with the project, because it sounds like the regulatory stuff continues to head in their direction.
Jason, it's probably worth noting that their target right now, I believe, is 2025. They recently got a $1.3 billion commitment from the Department of Energy. I think they've got they wanted to get a total, I believe, 12 of the units. I think they've got 6 of them. They're 60 megawatts a piece, I believe, that they've got committed at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is that's really looking at the first one of those commercial projects. So could we see the first project in 5 to 10 years? Absolutely. Are we probably going to see a lot of small modular nuclear reactors or other nuclear technology in the next 5 to 10 years that's going to change the market considerably? Probably not. It's going to take a little longer than that before we would ever see enough of it at scale to matter.
We've got a couple more questions. First one is, how difficult and or expensive would it be to develop or convert existing generation facilities to burn hydrogen?
So yeah, that conversation is underway. There's actually a research project that we're participating in now to determine what's feasible for both producing hydrogen at scale at a cost that's manageable, but then what kind of technologies is it going to take to use that hydrogen? And so some of the major turbine manufacturers are looking at the metallurgy in their turbines and determining what percentage they think their existing fleet could burn of hydrogen, like a blend of hydrogen and natural gas, all the way up to 100% or pure hydrogen. I think it's safe to say there's a lot of uncertainty in both the turbine industry and then the natural gas industry on how that hydrogen will affect the metallurgies and the components in all of their systems. But there's optimism that they're going to be able to figure out ways to use some of that existing infrastructure and burn a higher and higher percentage of hydrogen in it.
Yeah, that's really the billion-dollar question, and that's billion with a B. For sure in the industry. If the hydrogen horse comes into the barn and you can use hydrogen, well, maybe a lot of our resource mix doesn't look much different than it does today. You're burning hydrogen instead of natural gas. It's dispatchable. Things are pretty good. If the hydrogen doesn't pan out the way everybody hopes, then this gets a lot more difficult. So that's definitely one of the big things everybody's looking at.
Another question is their thought on investing in education, incentives, conversion cost support, and consulting to help smaller businesses, residential, lower their demand and convert to systems to lower emissions. I might kind of add a little bit to that. So I think there is thought around a lot of that. In terms of, for example, education, and as also part of that question, I think what the question gets to is there's some thought about electrification, right? So where if we're targeting a net zero goal, so we're actually trying to reduce emissions across the board. If we begin to target the transportation sector, for example, and we try to convert that to cleaner generating electricity, then that's certainly something that not only are we thinking about currently, but something that could be part of the future depending on what the ultimate goal is. An example is we have an ongoing educational series with the community on electric vehicles. We have provided rebates on the purchase of electric vehicles in partnership with the Nebraska Environmental Trust. We have promoted and we've had some success in getting some additional electric vehicle charging stations deployed around the community. That's just one small example. There are other electrification efforts that could be undertaken that we haven't yet gotten into, but that's one example of something that would definitely be part of the menu of options. And I think Jason touched on that. He was looking over the various scenarios. That in a net zero scenario, electrification would be a tool in the toolbox, along with all of the supply side resources that would be part of that.
There is,
Gentlemen, do you want to add additional thoughts on that?
yeah, I'm just going to add, there's no doubt LES is going to try and leverage things we can do on the customer side of the meter as much as possible. And it's going to be like it always has been before. What's the lowest cost, most effective way to do it? A lot of times that's going to be with generation we add on our side. A lot of times that's going to be programs we look at promoting on the customer side. You've seen us do it in the past with Sustainable Energy Program. We talked about today, a lot of people were signed up on peak rewards, where we actually control people's Wi-Fi thermostats in the summer to reduce that air conditioner load at peak. What's that do for us? Well, if we can drop our peak load, it reduces our need for the next generating resource. And if we're not putting in more generating resources, that's carbon emissions we don't have to worry about. I think you're seeing it even today where LES has just recently announced a program where we're taking our ongoing electric vehicle study, where we're monitoring electric vehicles that customers are driving throughout our service territory to learn more about their charging and driving habits. And coming up in 2021, we're going to leverage that. And we're actually going to roll the charging for those vehicles under the umbrella of peak rewards. So not only are we going to control air conditioning load in the summer, we're going to control electric vehicle charging load as well. And we're going to do it beyond the summer. We're going to do it in a couple of winter months. Now that pilot's really important because those are the kind of things you're looking at trying to leverage going forward to minimize the need to add new generation, which eliminates carbon emissions you'd have to worry about in the future. So I think that's going to be a big part going forward.
And then also to that, of course, is our customer-owned solar, where we have net metering. We have incentives in the form of a capacity payment. We have a very streamlined interconnection process. We have the virtual net metering. So the question here is pretty spot on. And in fact, it isn't something that necessarily we're waiting for the future. We're actually very engaged with all of those options right now. So it'd just to be a matter of ramping it up. In order to meet the goal, if that's the direction we're going to head in. I think there was one follow-up question to clarify, and the question here is: the local natural gas peaking stations are a small percentage of the total kilowatt hours produced, and the question that was being posed is really to compare the cost per kilowatt hour of coal and natural gas to wind or solar. Is there disparities of significance between the fossil fuel cost per kilowatt hour versus the renewables like the wind and solar cost per kilowatt hour?
But if you just look at the energy component or the fuel cost, the variable cost of fuel, coal has been fairly consistent over a large number of years, being in the, I don't know, maybe $12 to $15 a megawatt hour range. The natural gas prices have varied quite a bit over the last 10 years, but certainly recently natural gas prices are very, very low. So when you get down at the market level of gas prices that are in the $2 and $3 range, well, then you get the variable cost of energy coming from natural gas resources actually starting to compete with coal resources. On the solar and wind side, it's a little more complicated there because you not only have the cost of the project that's built into the energy rate that we get charged when we enter into those contracts, But then you also have the impact of either the investment tax credit or the production tax credit. But with the reductions or the improvements they've made in the technologies and then the implementation of those tax credits, you're seeing wind projects, that are getting very competitive, with the variable cost of energy from coal and natural gas, and even solar now is getting pretty competitive in that same type of cost range.
Another question here, is there any new movement toward neighborhood fuel cells?
So I'll take a crack at it, and Scott, feel free to help in here. The most recent thing I listened to was a panel session on some of the technologies that Toyota is pursuing. And they seem to be pretty bullish on fuel cells for the vehicle market, especially large transport vehicles, but even on the small vehicles. And this is just my opinion. The message they conveyed is that they're getting quite good at fuel cell technology for vehicles. If that can translate over into the residential market, I don't know that I can really comment on that. But kind of like what you see with battery technology in vehicles, then being transferred over to the utility industry. If they make that same type of improvement in their fuel cell technology for vehicles, well, maybe you see some advancements that become now viable for the electric utility industry to use, either at a large or a small scale. I think you said the question was down to the residential area. So maybe it does become viable, but right now, no, I can't think of any projects that would be at the residential level. Maybe some for high reliability, extreme backup situations for data centers or something like that, where they wanted to use fuel cells, but I'm just not familiar with them at the residential level yet.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add is we had a consultant, really knowledgeable in the industry, trends in the industry in here. I think Mark actually arranged to bring him in a couple years ago. And he made the comment to all of us here that, when you look at fuel cells today, all the experts will tell you fuel cells are a decade away from taking over the industry. And that's great news. The bad news is, for the last few decades, fuel cells have always been a decade away from taking over the industry. They've always apparently been right on the cusp, but 10 years later, they're still just there on the cusp. One of these days, that technology is probably going to pop. You just don't know sure when it's going to be because it's been promised in the past.
So we have one more question, and this is just jumping to the bottom line. Here's the question. So when are the rates going to start going up?
So, okay, I'll jump in first. Really it's going to depend on the magnitude of the goal and the time frame for the goal. Scott shared the modeling that his group did on a 2030 zero CO2. With the time frame that it takes to put some of those technologies in place, it just takes time to build equipment. If we needed to meet a very early goal, well, we're probably just a few short years away from needing to start building some of those resources. And once we start building them, we're going to start incurring capital costs or maybe some type of contract cost, and then that's going to start making its way into the rates. If the goal is farther out in the future, well, maybe we have a little bit of time to see how technologies evolve. We don't need to move quite so quickly on some of the technologies that aren't really readily available yet. And so maybe we can jump in on those technologies as they improve and the costs come down. So maybe it's, several years before you see things hit the rates. Really it's just a matter of how the technology changes and the market changes, and then how quickly that goal needs to be accomplished, based on where the board sets the goal for us.
Yeah, I think we mentioned it before. Look, we're going to do the same thing at LES that we've been doing for the last 10 years plus, right? We made all those CO2 reductions in the last 10 years. And why did we do that? Not because we had a goal, because we made the right decisions at the right times, or at least we tried to take advantage of opportunities when we thought they were at their brightest. We're going to do the same thing with this goal. Now, at some point, as Jason mentioned, you're going to start to run out of runway, and the goal is going to probably press you a little bit to be a little more aggressive with your decisions. But all along the way, we're going to try and make the right decisions at the right times to pursue the goal, but still do it in a reliable and low-cost manner.
So that looks like that is the extent of the questions. Before I have Jason or Scott talk about what the next steps are going to be, we did have a number of folks join in at certain points during the presentation. So a couple things. Number one is if you haven't already, if you'd like to put your name in the chat box and the organization you're representing, that would give us a good accounting of the folks that we've been able to engage in the community in this very important discussion. And then also there is another meeting of this type later this afternoon. I believe it's at 5 o'clock. There
6
was
o'clock.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Scott. 6 o'clock. There was in your email that included the link to this meeting. There was also information about interest if you wanted to participate. You'll hear some of the same information as part of the presentation, but if you had additional thoughts, you can participate that way, or certainly you can drop a note to your account executive. You can drop a note to me directly, mshkolnick@les.com, or Scott S. Benson at les.com. What we really want to do is make sure we're getting thoughts and if questions, feedback to funnel on to the board, who will be deliberating and making decisions in the coming days and weeks. And so with that, Jason, Scott, would you like to kind of just mention how this process will proceed ahead and where things are heading now?
Yeah, so like we mentioned, we had a board meeting last month where we queried the board and got some of those poll results that we shared with you. The next steps for us were to do these meetings that we're having now, try to gain input from the public and compile that input into something that we can share with the board and some of the committees. And then at the November meeting, share that information, put it into a format that allows the board to see what feedback we got from the public. And then we'll be working on a draft resolution that puts some ideas in front of them for how the LES goal could actually be assembled. And then I guess presumably take action at the November board meeting.
Great, thank you. Looks like we have one more question that's come in, and that is, what has LES learned relative to current protocols to calculate carbon sequestration activities? Are there methodologies that are gaining acceptability in terms of the carbon value of an urban tree canopy?
So we've looked at that some, not in great detail though, I will tell you, because we really think something like that probably comes more on the back end of the goal. If you've got a goal that's going to stretch a few decades, most of the big hitter things are going to be changes you make to your resource portfolio. So we're going to be monitoring those things, trying to, again, make those right decisions at the right times. But if the board does go forward with their earlier thoughts and provide us with a net carbon reduction goal, we will be staying in tune with the opportunities we have out there for those net reductions, those carbon reductions outside of our resource area. So we'll be watching those, but we think the initial things will all be focused on our resource portfolio, because that's probably where you're going to make far and away the most movement.
Well, I want to thank everybody who not only took time out of their early morning to participate, but the questions here have just been tremendous. These are important questions to ask. The comments you've shared are taken very seriously, because this is a very serious goal that's about to be established. It's going to drive just an enormous amount of decisions going forward in the future. And so your engagement in this process is just critical. It's something that is just kind of an inherent part of a public power utility, is to do these kinds of conversations and engage ratepayer owners in these kinds of decisions. So on behalf of all my colleagues here at LES, I am thankful for your participating. We did record our conversations here, this webinar, so that folks who may have missed the presentation will have an opportunity to view it again, because some of you did join in a little bit later in the presentation, and we certainly want you to have the ability to view that. Scott, Jason, is there any other information about when or where the video we plan to post will be available?
I know these slide presentations are going to get out on les.com. I'm not 100% sure where they'll be located, but you go to the homepage and I'm sure we'll make it clearly available to everybody.
Well, super. And we're right at 9 o'clock. We want to respect your time. Again, on behalf of my colleagues here at LES, thank you for participating and have just a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.